Let me begin by introducing myself. I am William Augustine Wallace of the Order of Preachers, the Dominican Order, and I will be giving 6 introductory lectures on the philosophy of nature. I first learned philosophy of nature during my early studies in the Dominican Order, when I was then close to 30 years of age. That was after a naval career during World War II, in which my main work was in science and engineering. Now, it is common for people who study philosophy as their main interest to begin with a course on the philosophy of nature. This is a difficult beginning, particularly for those who already have the mindset of modern science, as I know from experience. But I shall try to minimize that difficulty by showing the harmony that can exist between the philosophy of nature and modern science. I will also be using examples drawn from science wherever this is possible. The main text I shall use is my own, The Modeling of Nature, Philosophy of Science and Philosophy of Nature in Synthesis. It was published by Catholic University Press in 1996. To supplement this, I will draw on one of my earlier books, The Elements of Philosophy, published by Alba House in 1977. This is essentially a compendium of all the philosophy articles in the New Catholic Encyclopedia, of which I was the editor for philosophy. It would be desirable to have access to the entire 15-odd volumes of the New Catholic Encyclopedia, but this is not necessary for the course. Historical notes. Philosophy of nature can make claim to being the oldest branch of philosophy. Perhaps this is the reason why students of philosophy start with that discipline. It began in the 5th century before Christ, when Ionian philosophers, notably Thales of Miletus, speculated about the basic stuff of the universe, matter in its most primitive form, which the Ionians identified with the nature of things. A different approach was that of the Greek philosopher Plato, who saw form as distinctive of various natures. Plato postulated ideal forms existing in some heaven apart from earth, in which he thought earthly forms somehow participated. It was Plato's student, Aristotle, who in the 4th century before Christ took Plato's forms from the heavens and put them into things, maintaining that there is where forms really exist. For Aristotle, both matter and form satisfied his idea of nature. He explained this teaching in a work called The Physics. This gets its name from the Greek physis, translated into Latin as natura, which is the origin of our English word nature. Aristotle's Physics is one of the most durable works in the history of philosophy. It occupied the attention of the Greeks until the 6th century of the Christian era, and then was studied by the Muslims until the 12th century. It took on new life in the 13th century, in the universities of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where it was required of all students. Indeed, this requirement lasted well into the 17th century. Not surprisingly, Aristotle's Physics provides the core teaching I shall be explaining in these lectures. They do, of course, require development and exemplification in terms of discoveries made since the 17th century with the rise of modern science. To show the correspondence between the titles of my lectures and the matters treated in the 8 books of Aristotle's Physics, I employ my first schema. I shall be using graphical aids such as this throughout my lectures to illustrate the points I am making. These are available as diagrams to those taking the course for credit. Many of their figures are from The Modeling of Nature, though generally with numbers different from those in this lecture series. My first diagram is figure 1.1, which is not found in modeling. It shows in parallel column the lecture title and the source in Aristotle's physics. The first lecture, Fundamental Concepts, from Book 1. Second lecture, Nature, the Inner Dimension, from Book 2. The third lecture, Nature's Powers and Natural Kinds, basically in Book 2, but also in parts of Aristotle's De Anima. And Lecture 4, Nature's Property, Motion or Change, found in Book 3 of the Physics. The fifth lecture, Nature's Measures, Place and Time, in Books 4 through 6 of the Physics. And the final, the sixth lecture, Nature's First Unmoved Mover, found in Books 7 and 8. How we know things. Aristotle begins the physics with the cryptic statement that in natural philosophy we must proceed from what is more known to us to what is more known to nature or is more knowable in itself. Unpacking that statement will enable us to explain a few concepts relating to the theory of knowledge that are indispensable for our enterprise. What Aristotle means by this statement is that we gain knowledge of nature from our senses, or from sense experience, the type of knowing that is more obvious to us. But a deeper knowledge is also possible for us through our minds or our intellects, which enable us to transcend the knowledge of individuals provided by our senses. Our intellects are capable of grasping the natures of things as they are in themselves, through universals. Universals are less obvious to us, but with their aid we can go beyond the surface appearance of things as presented by our senses. In Aristotle's theory of knowledge, we attain intellectual knowledge through sense experience, for with him nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. But sense knowledge for Aristotle was not as simple as it might first appear. Actually, it is attained in two stages. The first stage is provided by our sense organs, the eye, the ear, the nose, the mouth, the skin, called outer senses because they are on the periphery of our bodies. When properly stimulated, each of these organs produce within us a sensation, proper to the particular sense. These are the sensations of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. The second stage then complements our outer senses by other senses we have in the interior of our bodies called inner senses to distinguish them from the outer senses. The organs for these senses were not easily identified by the Greeks, but we now know that they are lodged in our brain and nervous system. In a simplified view, the inner senses may be seen as made up of three components: the central sense, the imagination, and the memory. What is common to all three is they are concerned not with a sensation, as are the outer senses, but with what I shall call a percept. A percept is nothing more than a unified sense image, a composite of the sensations produced by the outer senses. It is generated by the first of the inner senses, the central or unifying sense. This receives sensations and integrates them into a singular composite representation. In doing this, it forms the percept, and the process by which it does so is known as perception.